but we're still talking about 3,500 pools. This is still 3,500 times the liquidity required. And I don't know. This is posing a really big problem to me. Even with just 3,500 trading pairs here, and we're just talking about NASDAQ, by the way, even that is too much liquidity. Like you simply cannot provide enough liquidity to facilitate that. And I think people like the idea of XRP being that conversion asset in these bilateral AMMs, but it's not based in reality. Like how wonderful would it be to have 3,500 different accounts pre-funded with loads of XRP to facilitate these trades? Yeah, but the fragmentation simply costs too much even still. Yes, we've reduced it from 4.5 million down to 3,000 or 3,500. It's still monumental. It's still not possible. And so we are presented with this uncomfortable situation where we've got multi-currency pools that don't involve XRP, or the way that you can involve XRP is still too much fragmentation, too much liquidity is required. It wouldn't be possible. But when I was actually doing this, I was panicking. I was like, oh my God, what have I just discovered? This is like not good. Then it kind of became very apparent to me that the only reason we're worried about pre-funding is because there simply isn't enough money. How is there not enough money? What are the factors that determine whether there is sufficient money? And I came to a conclusion, and it's kind of the most exciting thing ever, because not because, this is great for XRP or bad for XRP. That's not the point. The point is I'm getting through the discovery of this in a logical way, and I'm finding the next stage, and I'm developing my research, and it's just exciting for me on that front. If you are also excited about this and you're just enjoying this whole series, click like and subscribe. It does really help these videos. So the only way out of this situation, the only way that XRP is chosen, is if the rules around the speed of the XRP, the velocity that the XRP moves, is defined. We need definition on that, because if the XRP moves slowly, the fragmentation becomes a real problem. The amount of liquidity needed becomes a problem to the degree where XRP would not be considered. It wouldn't become a routing hub for this whole system. But if velocity is fast, we now enter a situation where fragmentation is not a problem. And we're going to get into this in the next video in a far deeper way, by the way. We're really going to dive into velocity, by the way, but I want to do a good job of explaining that reasoning here as well. Right now, everything seems to be pointing towards multi-currency liquidity pools. It makes the most amount of sense. You can consolidate, you're not fragmented all around, and you might need, a handful, maybe a couple of handfuls of these multi-currency AMMs to provide your payments to the rest of the world, just for CBDCs, by the way. That seems to be the leading route that things would take. However, if you could just remove fragmentation completely as a problem, then actually the XRP route becomes far more appealing than the multi-currency AMMs. Because even with multi-currency AMMs, you're still likely requiring 10, 20 different AMM pools there, even if they are multi-currency pools, because there's so many different currencies, you're still needing 10 to 20 times the liquidity to do that, right? The fragmentation is still real with multi-currency AMMs, so it doesn't entirely solve the problem. Now, even though the XRP side, where you have bilateral capability, where it's only on the XLS30, because XLS30 limits you to just 2 currencies in a pool, the only way that that can work is if the XRP in there moves faster. Because if you can move the XRP faster, it can be reused again quicker, and you actually need less tokens to facilitate the transactions. Meaning that fragmentation, even if you had 4.5 million combinations of bilateral AMMs, it doesn't matter. It's negated if the XRP can move at a sufficient speed. Do you see where I'm going with this? The question becomes, do the central banks want to use a multi-currency AMM that still has a level of fragmentation and efficiency cost, or do they want to remove fragmentation entirely? I don't know. It seems like removing fragmentation is a really great option. And for me, that really lines up with the idea that XRP could be a routing hub where you have bilateral AMMs and they all just default to using XRP because it's the path of least resistance, especially if the velocity is high. If the velocity is low, it's a no-brainer the other direction. Like, you don't want to use XRP in that way, but if it's fast, it becomes very appealing. So this is how XRP is actually chosen. It's not a boardroom thing. I don't necessarily believe that, although I will reserve a chance that that happens. And if it does, wonderful, because we'll see a $327,000 XRP and we're all rich. Like, it doesn't matter at that point. So we'll reserve that as a possibility. But if we look at the actual documentation, there's a way that XRP actually gets chosen, not by a boardroom, but just by being a path of least resistance. The biggest defining factor as to whether that will take place is the speed that XRP moves. So it becomes very simple. We go to BIS or we go to IMF and we figure out how fast should crypto move as a settlement asset. So you look into all the information, nothing. There's absolutely nothing about velocity.